Hello and welcome to the High Maintenance Hippie podcast. This is your host, Ashley from Ashley Taylor Wellness. On this podcast, we talk about all things beauty, health, wellness, and optimization. Being a high maintenance hippie represents not being boxed in, as I strongly believe that one size does not fit all. I'm a nurse turned coach, and I have learned so much about both conventional and alternative options, and I want to help you expand your options. I'm here to inspire you to learn new ways to improve your quality of life and to take your power back. I'm so excited that you're here, so let's get started. Hello, and welcome back to the High Maintenance Hippie podcast. Today, I am very excited to have Dr. Jason Saunders with us. He is someone who I have met through a mutual acquaintance for me, good friend for Dr. Jason, which is Dr. John Lawrence. And these men are truly leaders, the best of the best. And it's just such an amazing group of people, and I've learned so much. So I'm really excited to get to know Jason a little bit better today and hear more about his expertise, which is hyperbaric oxygen therapy. He is a chiropractic physician, as well as having a PhD in molecular biology. So he knows a lot about the human body, and I'm excited for you to share your wisdom with us today. So thanks for being here, Jason.
Ashley, thank you for having me. I'm excited to share as much as I can with you and your audience.
Awesome. Okay, so I always like to ask people, why did you become a doctor? In this case, a chiropractor, because for a lot of people, they think doctor and they think MD. So did you ever want to go down that path? And if not, why did you decide to get into chiropractic?
So I never really, as a kid especially, I actually was going to be either an auto mechanic or a motorcycle mechanic. I like taking things apart, put them back together, try to see how they work and make them, try to optimize their performance. So that was pretty much as far as I ever really thought about it. Or maybe, mechanical engineer would be like the furthest I would have potentially taken that. I had an injury in high school wrestling, where I had a herniation in my neck, and that disc injury was, it was pretty terrible. I had to stop wrestling. I was pretty well out of any physical activity. Many times my head and my neck were just, stuck in spasm, basically. A lot of numbness and tingling in my fingers, weakness, and all the like. My mom was never like big in going to doctors in general. It wasn't like I was going to the hospital or anything, but like this was a pretty big issue. So we were starting to see some doctors. They were mostly recommending, surgery. At the time, I didn't really want surgery. My mom, really was against surgery in general if we could avoid it. And, we probably saw about 7 or 8 different doctors over the course of about 5 or 6 months. And finally, a friend of mine said, you should really go see my chiropractor. And I'm like, listen, I've seen some of the best neurologists. We were living in the Northeast in New Jersey, in New Jersey, New York City, these guys are telling me that there's really not a lot I can do other than surgery. Like, what's a chiropractor going to actually do? Mm-hmm. But just through desperation, I eventually went, and literally within a matter of a few weeks, it was noticeably different. And in the matter of a few months, it was literally gone. And that got my wheels turning. I was like, this is crazy. I went to some, quack doctor, never expected really any results, and it was completely life-changing. And so I didn't really decide in that moment, but it really woke something up. And then, through some other experiences in college, I said, I should really explore this a little bit more. It's very mechanical, like the way that I think in terms of repair and, anatomy and all the pieces. How does it work and how do we improve it? So, eventually through college, it became crystal clear that was the direction I should go.
Amazing. I shared with you briefly before we got started that I've worked with many doctors as a nurse, but also as a patient. And in my personal opinion, I feel that chiropractors, not every single one, but as a whole, that profession seems to really get the body and how it's all connected. And I also am a fan of naturopathic doctors and MDs and DOs, but what, in your opinion, makes chiropractic medicine and care different than a traditional allopathic approach?
I think that's a great question. I guess we can't speak for the entire profession, but what I would say is this: a lot of like an overwhelming majority of chiropractors either were going to be medical doctors, wanted to be medical doctors, knew they wanted to help people, and then, very similar to my story, had some sort of experience, injury, family member, whatever, where traditional medicine like clearly didn't get the result that they needed, ended up seeing a chiropractor, and it was like a 180, like, oh my God, I had no idea that chiropractic even did X, Y, or Z, let alone could possibly help these different conditions. So it's such a personal journey for the overwhelming majority. Melissa, my wife, is also a chiropractor, also a very specific and personal journey that kind of brought her in that direction as well. So, I think we're just so committed to it in a different way because we're like, it's so powerful and it affected me or my family, and I want to help people in that way, so.
Yeah. I just think that it's so beautiful, the relationship that you and your wife, Melissa, have. And if you haven't listened already, I was on her podcast. We talked about coffee enemas, but you two are just such an amazing power couple, but very loving. And I remember when I met Melissa at, it was, I believe, Elements of Vitality, the event in Sarasota. She was just so welcoming, and you two are incredible. So I'm really grateful to know you. And the work that you're doing on top of that is even better. So it's great when someone has a skill, but when they're an amazing person, it's even better. So you both
appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So, what limitations did you see when you first became a doctor in getting people the outcomes they were looking for? And I asked this because, was hyperbaric oxygen therapy something that you were familiar with and utilizing from day one? Or was this something that you discovered, well, maybe you knew about it, but you implemented more so to fill in a gap? What was that like?
So I think in general, chiropractors, also naturopaths too, I think fall into this category in many ways, but we tend to just have a very open mind with regard to, is this something that may or may not be able to help my patients? Sometimes all the research is there, sometimes it's not. As a clinician, we take a very broad stance to say, listen, if it's not going to hurt and it has the potential to help, I'll try it. Usually on ourselves first, then some, close friends or family, and then ultimately into the practice. But we have a very open mind when it comes to implementing, I think, new technologies, new treatments, et cetera. So again, a very personal journey. Now, it wasn't my neck, but I was remodeling a house. So like nights and weekends, we had bought our first home and we were going to renovate it and flip it. And I was literally like a year out of chiropractic school at this time, but I ended up herniating a disc in my back. And so, Melissa was a chiropractor as well. She's treating me. My background was exercise physiology and nutrition. So I'm like, I'm doing all the nutrition I can think of. I'm doing all the rehab I can think of. She's treating me. But I was left with a very significant neuropathy now again, but this time in my right leg. And I actually had drop foot in my right foot. And so through the treatments that we were doing, my back pain was gone. I was treating patients again. Her and I were, training for she was doing like Ironman. I was just training with her. And so I could barely even walk, let alone like run or bike or anything like that because of this neuropathy. And about a year and a half later, I still had this issue. I just started to think, I was only 25, maybe almost 26 at the time. I started thinking that, that's it. That's just how my life is going to be. And I was pretty disappointed because you can imagine as a chiropractor, like I treat disc injuries now, I treat back pain. I'm like, how is this not something that we're able to fix on me? It's not good for business or my ego for that matter. So anyway, 18 months later, I'm at a conference and, there's a whole vendor hall, tons of different equipment. They had these chambers. I had no idea what it was. This is 17 years ago. And so, it looked interesting. So I took it for a spin. I was in there for like 20 minutes. It pressurized, it depressurized. I didn't think much of it. I'm walking around the vendor hall and all of a sudden I had pins and needles in my right foot. And that was the first time in 18 months that I even felt anything in my right foot. And so it started to like wake up this idea, like, wait, did that thing I just did have something to do with my nerves? I had no clue at the time. So I went back and I spoke to the guy. Of course, he was like, yeah, no, that's what it does. And I'm like, yeah, right. But we did about 8 hours of treatment over the next 4 days in 30-minute increments. And I probably left that show with about 15-20% recovery of that neuropathy. And so at that point, I was like, nothing's touched this. All of a sudden, I have this, feeling coming back into my foot. So I did buy one. I had no intention at the time of bringing it into the clinic. I just wanted my leg back. And within a few months of treatment, I had a full recovery of that. And so that got me really interested to say, how did I get that far? And at the time, now I know that I actually don't know that much. At the time, I thought I knew everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm like, how did I get this far in my life with all this training and background? And but hyperbaric was never something that even was on the radar. And so, we started getting into the research at that point. We really started to try to understand what mechanisms of action hyperbaric was having on the body. And, it took us a long time to really build that out. But over the next 3 or 4 years, we started building, a whole hyperbaric portion to our clinic. And just, to me, just to summarize it, we could talk more about it, but, hyperbaric is just delivering oxygen.
Mm-hmm.
Oxygen is just, in my mind, it's a nutrient. Your body already uses it. It's required for energy production and healing and regeneration and, all the things that our body does. And we're just limited to how much oxygen our body can carry under normal circumstances. And hyperbaric creates a pathway to deliver exponentially higher levels of oxygen. And that surplus is what our body can then use to heal and regenerate. And so, to me, 18 months after a nerve injury with drop foot, you would think, well, that's it. The nerves are probably dead at that point. And to see some return of function in literally 20 or 30 minutes, it's like, that was in contrast to physiology, the way I learned it. And so it became really important to me to start getting that information out there and educate people. And at this point, in addition to obviously running it in our clinic, we spend a lot of time trying to help other practitioners implement hyperbaric, because at this point, it's still, the awareness is growing, but in most people's lives, like, they'd still have to travel an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours to even get to the nearest chamber. So, if we could help other practitioners implement this strategy so that more people have access, that's like a huge part of our mission at this time.
Amazing. I first heard about hyperbaric oxygen therapy when I was a nurse. We didn't have that available in the hospital at the time, but some outpatient centers that were wound centers for really, really tough wounds, I know that patients would receive those types of treatments. So in the allopathic mainstream community, what would be reasons that people use this? What is not considered alternative? So wounds would be one.
Yeah.
There are a lot of other benefits that I'll share that I've experienced too, but those are considered not enough evidence. So what does the evidence show for those conditions?
So, and part of it, I'd say part of it's evidence-based for sure, but a lot of it's also politics, which we either choose to or not talk about later. But there are 14 indications that are quote unquote like FDA approved indications for hyperbaric, the way you're describing, for on-label use. And for the most part, if you really look at the scope of them, it's really either life-threatening or limb-threatening conditions. You mentioned wound care. You have this wound, it's infected, it's going to lead to gangrene, it's going to become necrotic, we're going to need to amputate, right? So as somebody's going down that road, somewhere along the line, we can draw and say, listen, if we don't get oxygen into that wound, we're clearly moving in the wrong direction. Now, there's a lot of, hospital procedure that needs to happen. There's a lot of hurdles to get over before you'd even get hyperbaric covered, even in those scenarios.
Right.
But if you look at all 14 indications, carbon monoxide poisoning, like literally we're about to die, gangrene, osteonecrosis, so like bone infection, bone death, osteomyelitis. What else? Certain burns, especially like full thickness burns, or burns that are. I think technically for insurance purposes, you need to have burns over 20% of your body.
Okay.
Severe anemia, where a blood transfusion is either not possible or being denied. But for the most part, it's literally, we either have to, you're going to lose a limb in the next short period of time, or potentially it's life-threatening. And in those cases, if we add oxygen, first of all, the response rate is enormous. It's very, very high. But in order to get it covered, it has to be, that extreme of a circumstance. If you really look at the mechanisms, though, which is interesting, when a wound gets stuck and it's not healing properly, it's stuck in what we call the inflammatory phase of healing. And so there's this inflammatory response, but there's all this capillary damage. Capillaries are where gas exchange, where oxygen exchange happens. And when these capillaries are damaged, we can't drive oxygen to the tissue that needs to be repaired. So when things get stuck, they get stuck because they lose that oxygen gradient. And hyperbaric is just something that massively increases the gradient and drives oxygen to those tissues. So to your point, it doesn't have to be a non-healing wound. Like if you've had an injury that isn't healing properly, if you've had surgery and you just want to maximize your recovery time, like these are all also wounds.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than waiting to find out if it's going to not heal or become necrotic, by adding oxygen during that process, it's incredible actually how much we can reduce a healing time or how well we could heal a lot of old injuries and things like that. It's just not approved, to your point, you know?
Well, for insurance, and
For
I do think
insurance.
the majority of people use insurance. I am a cash pay person for a variety of reasons,
Yeah.
but in 2019, I had a rhinoplasty revision. It was a 6-hour surgery and they removed some rib and that's how they reconstructed it. So in order to heal from that, I did a couple things. One was hyperbaric oxygen therapy. We actually rented one. It was the Viteris, I think that's how you say it, 320, which is one of the softer.
Like a home unit, basically. Yeah.
Yes.
People, yep.
And I'd love to get into the difference between the two. It had an oxygen concentrator with it. And an added bonus is if there was a little bit of tension between my partner and myself, one of us would just go in there and it felt like we were in our own little cocoon. But that wasn't the main reason. When I saw my surgeon, he was blown away at how fast I recovered.
Mm.
So it's interesting you mentioned that for surgery. And this was an elective surgery. It was something that he suggested though, but none of what I was doing was going to be covered by insurance anyway. And this is in Beverly Hills. So maybe there's an assumption that people have more resources. So I wish there was more accessibility to this because it's so powerful, not just for those things. But what was interesting is that my boyfriend had a Yorkie who was, I think at the time, 15 or 16, and he had a lot of seizures, but he had separation anxiety and always wanted to be with me. So I brought him with me every day and I used it, I would say an hour a day for 30 days. And he stopped having seizures for 3 months.
Wow.
So this isn't in a journal or anything. That was just what we witnessed. And we were like, wow, that's pretty powerful. So I don't know exactly how it was helping, but it really seemed to help him. And on top of that, my surgeon was blown away. How are you, recovering so well? This is unheard of. And I really think that was a big piece of it.
Yeah. I mean, oftentimes, let's say in our clinics, especially, we have a bunch of surgeons now that refer to us, but usually it starts because they have a client or two where some tissue's not healing well. There's some signs of necrosis, so they send them our way. And usually if we help a few of those cases, which, I mean, I literally can't even think of a time where it didn't help.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times I'll call those docs and I'll say, hey, we appreciate those referrals. We're happy to help your clients. I'll even say things like, listen, have you ever had that client where you think that they might not be a great case for you because for whatever reason, metabolically or inflammatory or whatever, they may or may not be like such good healers, And of course, I mean, they could usually pretty well predict who some of those folks are. I said, why don't no charge, like literally no charge at all. Send them to us before you even do the surgery. Let me do 6 hours of treatment before their surgery. We'll do another 6 to 10 hours after the surgery. Again, no charge. I just want you to see how this person responds, and you get to make a determination whether you think it made a difference or not. And literally every time I do that, that doctor then becomes actually typically a referring client for us because they're like, this person should not have responded this well to that, to this procedure. It's literally, and it's just oxygen, it's like, so simple, it's so safe, but it's incredible what people see in terms of changes. So yeah, that I like that Yorkie story as well. That's interesting.
It was really cool. My doctor rented out to a lot of, and I know this is going to be controversial, and I'm not saying there's, journal evidence for this or scholarly evidence, but sometimes we just need to make observations. And a lot of the families with autism, my doctor would rent this out and she found that to be helpful. I'm not saying that's the only thing, but it's just, to me, it's similar to ozone therapy, which is, well, O3 instead of O2 for the ozone, but that's really great for inflammation and infection. And I just feel so good after doing that. And same with the hyperbaric oxygen therapy. So it's like we have more options and people are afraid of oxygen. I think some people are. What is the mechanism of action? Is it that the oxygen is pressurized and that's what's allowing it to help the body? Is it that it's at a higher concentration? What is the hyperbaric oxygen chamber doing for a person different than maybe even oxygen just from a wall?
Yeah. So I get that question a lot. Can't I just get a tank of oxygen and breathe on a mask, or get a concentrator by itself, get a cannula? The truth is this: under normal atmospheric pressure, so, you and I are both pretty close to sea level in this moment. There's a pressure of your atmosphere. You don't feel that, but that's the pressure that allows you, when you breathe in, to drive oxygen from the atmosphere or the air that you're breathing into your circulation. It then gets bound to a red blood cell, and the red blood cells carry it throughout your body. That's normal physiology. And I'm sure most people know, like when you go to the doctor or the hospital, they put the pulse oximeter on your finger.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have any lung issues, if you don't have any heart issues, most of us should have 98, 97, maybe 99% saturation, meaning you're carrying, in this moment, you're basically carrying as much oxygen as your body's capable of carrying.
Mm-hmm.
We also know that if we went hiking or to Denver or to some mountain, it gets harder to breathe as you go up in elevation. People say, well, there's less oxygen as you go up. Air is 21% oxygen no matter where you are on planet Earth. So it's not a percentage of oxygen loss, but what it is a pressure of oxygen loss. So as you go up in elevation, you lose atmospheric pressure, and pressure is the driving force to absorb oxygen in the first place.
Okay.
When you go into a chamber, the opposite is true. You're not going up in elevation. Now you're going below sea level equivalent. And so as you go below sea level, pressure is increasing. And as pressure is increasing, you're literally now driving more oxygen than under normal circumstances. But you're already your red blood cells are already carrying as much oxygen as possible. So where does this extra oxygen go? It literally just gets dissolved into the liquid portion of our blood, the plasma.
Mm-hmm.
And so normally, like right now, for you and I, our plasma carries very little oxygen at all, about 3 milliliters per liter of blood. But under hyperbarics, we can increase that depending on how much pressure we're under, what percentage of oxygen you're breathing, and how long you stay there. We can go from 3 milliliters per liter up to like 60 milliliters per liter. So the plasma becomes almost an unlimited reservoir to handle all this extra oxygen. Once the oxygen's in your body, now it's free floating. It can get into every little nook and cranny wherever it needs to go. But the percentage of oxygen isn't what does that alone. Without the pressure change, you can't really bring that extra oxygen in. So it's that temporary increased pressure environment of the chamber that allows any of that to happen in the first place.
Okay. Very helpful. So today you are going to be flying, and that is one thing. I don't know if you have an Oura ring or a Whoop, or do you use any type of wearable?
Yeah, both. I have a Oura ring at night and a Garmin during the day usually.
Perfect. Okay. So for the Oura ring, my heart rate variability will dramatically decrease when I go on an airplane and if I'm changing time zones, but it just seems that is a really big stressor for me. And I was thinking, okay, well, maybe hyperbaric oxygen therapy could be helpful. Is that something that you recommend before flying, after flying? Would you not recommend that? Do you think that would be helpful? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So number one, does hyperbaric improve any of those things? The answer is yes. We consistently see, let's say, improved heart rate variability for almost everybody who tracks that when they're using hyperbaric. We also see improved sleep. So improved levels of deep sleep, improved levels of REM when people are using hyperbaric.
Mm-hmm.
So even though an airplane is technically kind of like a hyperbaric chamber, it's a pressurized environment, right? So the airplane itself is pressurized. However, it's still less pressure than what we're getting right now. And so we become relatively hypoxic when we're flying. And that's one of the things that leads to a lot of the symptoms that we get in terms of also jet lag and other things, like you said,
Mm-hmm.
changing time zones and the like. But you do spend hours basically hypoxic during that time. So landing and then getting into a chamber could be an amazing way to massively reduce how much the flights are negatively affecting things like sleep. It also improves how quickly people recover from jet lag. So for sure, after the flight, and it just so happens that most of my traveling, like you mentioned, I'm flying to a conference to talk about hyperbaric, and there will be chambers there. So it's almost like everywhere I go, I get to land and there happens to be a chamber there that I get to use. So, that works out, but not everybody necessarily will be that lucky. But certainly, even when we fly other places, I'll often look for a facility nearby where within the first day or so, especially if it's a big time zone change, within the first day or so, I can, jump into a chamber and just kind of recompress, get that oxygen flowing again, and then, move forward from there. On the flip side, you do want to wait, depending on how much oxygen you're getting, you always want to wait somewhere between, I'd say, to be super conservative, 18 to 24 hours before you fly. In other words, after a session and before you fly, just like scuba diving.
Okay. Say that again. So 18 to 24 hours on both ends?
No, just on the before you fly.
Okay.
End.
Okay.
Now, if you were in a chamber and you knew that you were getting 100% oxygen, for sure, that would not be a concern. You can go from there onto an airplane right away.
Okay.
The issue is that, especially let's say in soft chambers and the like, you're getting some amount of nitrogen. And nitrogen, so when you scuba dive, you're getting a lot of nitrogen. And you always want to wait about 24 hours, let's say, from a scuba diving trip until you go on an airplane. In an hyperbaric environment, if we don't know how much nitrogen we're getting, and we're not going to sit down and calculate that out, it's always really safe to say, 18 to 24 hours, you're definitely not going to have a problem.
Okay.
Could you shrink that window? Absolutely. But, as a generic statement for your audience or for whatever, if you don't know, it's nice to keep that window, I think, just to know that you won't have any issues.
Very helpful. So immediately after landing, you could go and do the hyperbaric.
Yeah, you can go from an airplane directly
Okay.
into a chamber, just like you can fly to Grand Cayman and jump in the water and go scuba diving.
Okay.
You just can't come back from the water and then jump on an airplane. It's the same thought process.
And the biggest concern for that would be what?
Well, so with the nitrogen load. So if a scuba diver, it's the Benz, if you're familiar with that.
No.
The Benz. So scuba diving accidents happen because you're breathing air, which is predominantly nitrogen. Mm-hmm. You're underwater, so you're getting a lot of pressure. That pressure is driving oxygen into your system, but that pressure is also driving nitrogen into your system. Oxygen gets metabolized and you get to use it, and it's a beautiful thing. And that's one of the fabulous pieces of hyperbaric. Nitrogen, there's no way to use it. It's inert. So as it's coming out of your system, it could start actually bubbling up, and you can have blood flow blockages and different neurological or vascular issues because of that.
Okay.
And so the Benz is the term for a condition where when a scuba diver comes up to the surface too quickly, that nitrogen is coming out and creates those blockages. Or if they get into an airplane too quickly, that same concept happens because they're losing pressure.
Okay.
In a chamber, again, in a soft chamber, you're not going very deep. You're only going about 10 feet equivalent. Mm-hmm. So the risks are very low. If you're going into a hard chamber, but it's air filled and you're going to a deeper pressure, there becomes more of a concern. But again, if you don't know all the details of what I'm saying, and you just knew, I'm going to keep an 18 to 24 hour window in between, you'll never have a problem and you don't even have to worry about it. But for sure, the reverse is totally fine. You can fly, you can fly to Australia, 18 hours, 20 hours on an airplane and go right into a chamber, have no problem.
Awesome. Thank you for clarifying that, because I knew more nitrogen, but what was that going to do? Okay. Let's see. So we talked about some of the official FDA approved uses, and this is just a conversation, not medical advice, but just with your own eyeballs, what have you seen? I shared faster recovery from surgery, helping with seizures in the dog. Sounds like improving jet lag. What things have you witnessed?
Sure. So in my office or in the offices of the people that we train or that we consult with and support, almost exclusively, these clinics don't do any on-label therapy. Mm-hmm. So it's almost entirely off-label, entirely non-insurance dependent. Mm-hmm. And it's not about treating those conditions as much as it is about improving oxygenation because of what increased oxygen can do for people with X, Y, and Z, whatever the thing is that they have, right? So again, to your point, it's not medical advice. We're not treating these conditions at all. we're just giving people oxygen, and then getting oxygen happens to have these certain effects.
Okay.
A short list of some of those effects, and then I'll convert this into like what that actually means in terms of what kind of people we treat. But some of those mechanisms are obviously increased oxygenation, period. It increases our immune system response, so it gives our immune system more energy to fight infection, as an example. Most pathogens, like most bad bacteria that can hurt us, are anaerobic, meaning they don't use oxygen as part of their metabolism. And so there's an antimicrobial effect of a high oxygen environment in terms of helping to clear out certain pathogenic candida, like mold and yeast species, but also anaerobic bacteria. It improves stem cells, so it mobilizes stem cells and other growth factors inside of our body. Obviously, it reduces inflammation. That's one of the biggest things that it's able to do. It helps us regrow new blood vessels. So especially where there's blood vessel damage or inflammation, and we can't drive oxygen because of capillary injury or damage, oxygen literally stimulates new blood vessel growth, regrowing these capillary beds. So that's just some of the main benefits. As a result, like, as you said, post-surgical, well, there's capillary damage, there's inflammation, there's, so it helps with those things. We use it traditionally for gangrene and osteomyelitis. Those are infections. So are there other infections that are anaerobic that might help, that hyperbaric might help with? Sure, like C. diff, like H. pylori, like Lyme disease or candida. So what we tend to do in the off-label world is we spend a lot of time understanding the mechanisms of action, why on-label conditions are on-label, and is it appropriate, and can we extrapolate out if it helps in these ways for these conditions, it may also help in these ways for these conditions. Obviously, more research needs to be done. Hands down, the people that respond the best are, I'll say, neurological cases as a blanket statement, but to me, that means post-stroke patients do amazingly well. You mentioned children on the spectrum, for sure. They tend, 75% of kids diagnosed on the spectrum have hypoperfusion, decreased blood flow, decreased oxygen to the temporal lobes of their brain, which is where language and communication live. So, or the prefrontal cortex, where behavior and executive function live. So if all of a sudden we have low oxygen going to certain parts of the brain and they're expressing symptoms associated with those parts of the brain not kicking in, getting more oxygen to those areas may very well, show improvement. And for sure it does, almost across the board. Patients with MS seem to respond really well. Again, neurologic and inflammatory. Most autoimmune conditions respond really well, from Crohn's and colitis through, RA and lupus, again, multiple sclerosis as well. So anything from neurologic to the immune system to then, the healing and regeneration. So soft tissue injuries that also don't have good blood supply, like tendons and ligaments, they seem to heal faster because we're driving oxygen to those areas. TBI and concussion, so brain injury, it's amazing how quickly these people seem to respond. Like your Yorkie story, it's starting to be used a lot more for mental health, anxiety, depression. Like you said, you saw less anxiousness. Seizure disorder, for sure. People are looking at not high doses of oxygen, but more in that mild to moderate range, seems to really help balance our neurotransmitters and can help keep seizure activity much lower. Again, not a cure, not a treatment directly for any of these things, but these are the things in our office at this point. We specialize in hyperbaric, but we don't really specialize in a particular category of patient or issue. As long as it's appropriate to use it, there won't be any consequence or there's no contraindication, and it may very well help. We're happy to offer it and see how far we can, help push somebody's health along.
Yes, it sounds like it's a way to help a person support their body so that their body can do what it needs to do, versus you have this, take this pill. It's how can I support the body so that it is able to more effectively heal?
Exactly. I mean, literally, chiropractic in a sentence is let the body heal itself. Certainly it's more complicated than that, but chiropractors in general are they're very much looking at neurological communication errors that are not allowing the body to express health in the way that we know that it could or should.
Mm-hmm.
Our standard therapies of the adjustments are to improve that neurological function. But that's one of the reasons I think so many chiropractors are attracted to oxygen therapies, is because it's not foreign. It's not some crazy, foreign chemical or this, patented, medication or drug. It's literally the same thing you need every minute of every day. It's just giving you just enough, a little bit more to create that regenerative healing environment. Again, exactly how you just said it, allowing the body to heal and do the things that we know that it does all by itself.
Yes, it's a different approach, but it seems, in my personal experience, to be more effective to remove the things that are getting in the way of the body being able to heal. And, sleep is such a big one. If I am not sleeping, where is my body going to have the energy, especially for cognitive issues? The lymphatic system, I've learned a lot about that. And you mentioned hyperbaric oxygen therapy being helpful for sleep. And, it's all connected. So these are all pieces of the puzzle. How can we strengthen the body and remove the things that are interfering with that homeostasis? So
Exactly.
That's the way, if you ask me. But there are many potential benefits if appropriate. And as always, one size doesn't fit all. But who would this not be appropriate for?
Good question. So in general, the overwhelming majority of people not only would tolerate it, would benefit from it for a variety of reasons, let's just say.
Okay.
I would also, in answering that, I want to express this. We use the word hyperbaric to describe a large continuum of therapy. Everything from the way you described, a soft chamber, which goes to 1.3 atmospheres, which is really only 30% more pressure than what you and I are getting right now, all the way to 2.5 or 3 atmospheres, 3 times what you and I are getting right now. And then breathing either air, which is 21% oxygen, or breathing oxygen at 100% oxygen, or somewhere in the middle. So we use the same word to describe a really large continuum of therapy. And part of the answer to that question is what pressure and what percentage of oxygen is most helpful for different people. If we use 2.8 atmospheres on 100% oxygen so that somebody doesn't die from carbon monoxide poisoning, we probably don't need that amount of pressure to help somebody who just had a mild concussion, right? And so I think that that's important. That's a big part of what I try to teach people is we have to apply the necessary amount of pressure and oxygen and frequency and duration of these sessions to get a benefit that we're looking for, but more is not better. And in some cases, more is actually more dangerous and unnecessary and potentially even inappropriate. So I say that as part of the answer to this because a lot of people benefit from hyperbarics, and we have to keep that in mind so that we say, listen, in some circles, let's say COPD, depending on how severe the COPD is, that might be a contraindication to hyperbaric, especially at really high pressures and really high percentages of oxygen. However, it could be very appropriate at more mild pressures or at lower percentages of oxygen, something that's still meaningful for the patient to get extra oxygen for healing, for inflammation, for their immune system, and all those, wonderful benefits, but we're not overexposing them that might hurt them. Let's say somebody with an autoimmune condition or multiple autoimmune conditions, they're very sensitive to oxidation. Hyperbaric is an oxidative therapy, just like ozone, the way you mentioned earlier. So here's this oxidized human, and we're exposing them to more oxygen. Is that dangerous for this person? Again, we have to use our clinical judgment to say, well, if we start really slow, low and slow, lower pressure, slower process, expose them over a period of time, increasing their percentages of oxygen or increasing the pressure over a series of sessions, we can help them tolerate that oxygen, not only in a way to handle higher levels if they need it, but also to make sure that not only we're not hurting them, but they're benefiting from the sessions that we're doing. And so there are probably 10 or 15 different relative contraindications that we talk about when I teach these classes, or I'm teaching, certifying people in hyperbaric medicine. And it's things like that: severe emphysema, COPD, diabetes, certain autoimmune conditions, certain chemotherapy agents. So there are definitely a range. Does that mean these people can't go in? No, it just means we need to think this through and come up with a really thoughtful plan for how we're going to implement this therapy safely and effectively. But there's only really two absolute contraindications to hyperbaric. One is a pneumothorax. So if you have a popped lung, you can't go in the chamber. There are very few people walking around planet Earth that have a popped lung and don't know it. But you could have had a pneumothorax in your past. As long as it was completely cleared and you've been released as far as that goes, you can go into a chamber.
Okay.
And then the other one is somebody that can't equalize their ears. So a tympanic membrane that's either too much scar tissue, or they just can't figure out how to equalize the ears. Just like scuba diving, more pressure becomes, potentially dangerous. You can injure your eardrum, your tympanic membrane. Patients should never, or clients should never have pain in the chamber. And so learning how to equalize that pressure, learning how to manage that pressure is critical to making sure not only that they're safe and effective, but that we're not hurting anybody unnecessarily. And so, having either a compliant tympanic membrane, swallowing, yawning, Valsalva, like the pinch and blow, having mechanisms for clearing that pressure is really important. We spend a lot of time with a new client teaching them that, because that's literally, in most cases, that's like the only thing that might inhibit somebody from being able to go in.
Yes. So yeah, let's talk about what the actual experience is like, because the first time I used it, I felt like my ears were going to pop. I'm like, is this what's supposed to happen?
Right.
I now understand that it is. And so I would do exactly that. I would put my fingers over my nose and close my mouth and kind of bear down, and that would help. So it's pressurized, but could you explain, briefly what is happening when you're going in there and why you wouldn't want to open it too?
Sure. So to your point, it's a hyperbaric chamber, increased pressure. So the pressure is building inside this enclosed, unit. Just like an airplane, particularly when the airplane is landing, most of us experience that same phenomenon. So as the airplane is landing, pressure is building. As you go into the chamber, initially, the first portion of that chamber visit, pressure is building. So when pressure is building around us, we have to do something to help equalize that. If you can picture, let's say in one of my ears, I have this tympanic membrane, and as pressure is building, it's really pushing on my tympanic membrane, and I need to do something to help equalize that pressure. And then it's going to build again, and then I do that same maneuver, to equalize that pressure. If not, it just keeps bending and bending and bending. And eventually, you could traumatize that tympanic membrane. You could even tear that tympanic membrane. That would be the worst case scenario. It's the most common injury in all of hyperbarics is injury to the tympanic membrane. And it's less than 2% of all the people who go in. So it's really not even that common. It's just that important because it's the most common that we talk about this. Mm-hmm. We spend a lot of time when somebody first comes to the office or is going to rent a chamber, like you said, what are the expectations? You're going to lay down, you're going to be relaxed, you're on a nice mattress, you have a pillow, you're breathing oxygen. But at some point, you're going to feel pressure in your ears. It's very important that you clear that pressure as soon as you feel it.
Okay.
10 or 15 seconds later, you're going to feel it again, clear it again. Don't let it build up, because if it builds up too much, it becomes harder and harder to clear. Mm-hmm. And then it might even hurt as you're trying to equalize it. Again, you should never have pain inside of this chamber. So it's important that you communicate that, and then I tell people, especially if there's a technician outside, if you're in a clinic, let them know that you're becoming uncomfortable, because there's things we can do to slow down the pressure, pause the pressure, back the pressure off. It's important that you're comfortable inside our equipment. And so if you communicate that with our technicians, there's so many things we can do to help you inside that chamber so that you have a comfortable experience. But that's literally the whole thing is, as if you're in there for an hour, almost that entire hour, you wouldn't even know you were under pressure. You don't feel pressure on your body. You don't feel pressure on your head or your arms. It feels almost identical inside the chamber as it does outside the chamber. It's only in the first 4 or 5 minutes while it's
Right.
pressurizing, and in the last 4 or 5 minutes while it's depressurizing, that you have any experience that you know that you're under some amount of pressure.
Yes.
But to your point, the Valsalva is probably the most common, which is the pinch your nose and blow.
Yeah.
Some patients, I usually say, when an airplane is landing and you feel that pressure change, what do you normally do? And everybody makes a funny face, like, oh, I do like this yawn thing, or I swallow, or I have a bottle of water. I'm like, yeah, whatever you normally do is probably fine.
Mm-hmm.
And you might want to know a couple other techniques just in case.
I would agree with that. Just from the patient end, it was for the first few minutes, and then it was like I was just in an enclosed area.
Right.
So claustrophobia, do you think the pros of taking a medication would outweigh the cons of the side effects of a benzo if someone needed that therapy? I mean, do you see people prescribing that, or would you say maybe this isn't the treatment for you? Obviously it's case by case, but is that something that's a common issue? Is people feeling afraid of being in an enclosed area?
So again, relative case by case, relative to the severity of whatever the issue is, right? So like, I mean, the most extreme maybe is like you have carbon monoxide poisoning. You're either going to get inside this tube or you might die. We're going to go inside this tube and I'll give you anything you need to get inside this tube. Versus a mild concussion, that you had 6 months ago. How important is it to take this medication to get into this chamber? That's a conversation to have, I think, between, let's say, practitioner and patient. That being said, there are a lot of people over the years. So in 17 years of doing this, literally hundreds of patients every month for almost 20 years, there's probably 3 or 4 people I can think of that wouldn't go into the chamber unmedicated.
Amazing. Yeah.
I find that even when the feeling is there, and I'd say the feeling is there for a lot of people, like who wants to go into like some enclosed thing that they don't know if they can get out of, right? Just saying that brings up like feelings for a lot of people. If you go slow with people, especially, let's say, even the soft chambers we use or the hard chambers we use, patients can get themselves out if they wanted to. So there's 2 things we do with those folks. One is we go really slow. We don't make it like, oh, come on, you got to go. Your session's, like, no, it's like, hey, take your time. I've had people like come in on Tuesday, come to the office, look inside the chamber, go home. Come back on Thursday, look inside, climb in. I won't close it, I promise, but just climb in, come out, go home. Come in, we'll close it, I'll open it. We'll close it again, I'll open it, whatever. We've gone that slow with people. And I think that helps build the trust. I find that it's far more of a trust issue and a confinement, like control situation, than it is like absolute, like claustrophobia. If you're that claustrophobic, you're probably not even calling our office. True. Truth be told, right?
Yes.
So if we go slow and we go at a pace that makes that patient comfortable and we build that trust over the course of a few days, and then I show them, I'm like, listen, if you want to get out, you can get yourself out. Open this, turn this, do this, do this. And then I say, but please don't do that. My technicians are trained. They love to take care of their patients. They'd feel like you're taking their job away from them. We don't want to have to pay you for your session. We pay them to take care of you. So here's how you would get out. But all I really need you to know is it's possible. And if you're having an issue, just communicate that, because they'll get you out right away. And literally, as long as we do those 2 things, give them their control back and go at a pace that they're comfortable, there's so few people that won't go inside unmedicated. It's just a question of really meeting them where they are and kind of building that out, So
yeah. Very well said, because a quote that I've heard many times is people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And I have had many patients who are uncomfortable with a procedure. And I agree, just sometimes we want to get all the things done, but we forget there's a human being there. And when you can listen to them and hear their concerns, it really does make a difference. And I think sometimes, not to place judgment, and I think there's a time and a place for medicine, but sometimes it's easier, just take this and go. But maybe what could also be helpful is just explaining the process, how you would get out. And I remember that because I was in the soft chamber and I think there was a little screw. I had to unscrew that so it could let some of the air out. And then at a certain point, then I could unzip and get out on my own. So I think that's a really helpful thing to explain so people know there's a way out, because the mind is so powerful and that could probably create a sense of panic. But I found it to be such a relaxing experience.
Yeah. You know, I spend so much time on that because it's not like patients are going to do one hyperbaric session and then they're cured of everything they've ever had, like as you well know, it's a long-term relationship. People are going to come 10 hours, 20 hours, 40 hours, 80 hours, So if they have a bad experience in their first session, the likelihood that they're going to see out the full protocol is almost zero. If they have a really good experience for the first few sessions, then that trust is built. Then the likelihood that they'll actually get the benefits is really high because they'll see through the whole process. My biggest nightmare is because hyperbaric still, as known as I feel like I think it is, I know that when I leave my little circles, it's like hyperbolic, bariatric. What is this thing you do?
Yeah.
And so if I want this thing to grow the way that I know that it can, and hopefully that it should, so that people get these benefits, I also know how important it is that people have that experience. When there's a client that's like, oh, I tried hyperbaric, it didn't work for me, which is totally true. I mean, listen, this is not like it's a cure-all for every human, but so many people, if I'm like, oh, tell me more, what happened? Well, I did it once and it hurt my ear, so I never went back. Oh, so you can't really say you tried it and it didn't work. Like you tried it, you had a bad experience, and so therefore, we didn't actually get to do the thing we wanted to do. Or, I did it 2 or 3 times and I still had headaches. I'm like, how long did you have headaches? 20 years. So 2 hours of oxygen didn't cure 20 years of headaches.
Right.
There's more to the story, right? So I really think it's important, to your point, like hearing people out, listening to their story, understanding, building rapport. It's all of our client, even in other areas of our office, I believe that all of our relationships have to be long-term relationships with our clients in order to really get them the results that they're looking for over the rest of their life. I think that's so much of what we do in the healthcare industry, hopefully. So we spend a lot of time with that anyway.
Well, thank you for that. Even separate from hyperbaric oxygen therapy, to have a provider who will answer your questions and not make you feel like a burden. We need more of that. And many doctors act as if that is doing patients a favor. It's quite literally the doctor's job is to teach the patient why we're doing certain things. And maybe people would be more compliant with treatments if they understood why they were doing them and had that safe space to troubleshoot. I want to give it a go, but this is really uncomfortable. But if the doctor is not willing to answer questions or is not approachable, then that could interfere with someone's ability to receive something that could really help them. So once again, I really, really thank you for that as a nurse and as a patient, because we need more of that.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So a couple more questions,
Sure.
because I know that you're going to be flying soon. But one, could you tell me the pros versus cons of a soft versus hard chamber? Is there a time where a soft chamber might be more appropriate? I know price is typically going to be better, but tell me a little bit about the pros and the cons of each of those.
So the full answer to that is we still have a lot of research to do to know the full answer to that.
Okay.
I just finished a research project comparing high pressure to low pressure, and we looked at a bunch of variables like inflammation and biological aging and cognitive abilities and hormones. And, we looked at comparing a bunch of these things, but we still need a lot more research even than the project I just finished. It comes down to a few things. There are certain conditions, again, we're trying to match an intensity of a therapy to a severity of a condition or goal. So if you're generally well and you're just looking to like use oxygen as a vitamin, as an example, a soft chamber environment could be perfect. If you have carbon monoxide poisoning and you had the option, can I go into a higher pressure hard chamber or a lower pressure mild chamber? You should pick the higher pressure hard chamber. Your severity of your condition warrants that higher pressure. If you had carbon monoxide poisoning and you could either go into a soft chamber or no chamber at all, I would certainly choose soft chamber over nothing. right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of the equation. The other part of the equation is what access do you have? You know, our clinics in Jersey, there are very few, if any, other clinics like ours in Jersey. If somebody needed hard chamber off-label use, like they're probably coming to our clinic. There are plenty of states or you know, we draw from like a 2-hour car ride radius, easy in any direction. And so, you know, other places more rural out west, like you could drive a day and a half before you find a chamber. And so in those cases, it might only be your option is to like rent or purchase a soft chamber so that you actually have use of this thing in your home. So part of it is making sure you're matching the right equipment to the right goal or condition or issue. And part of it is what amount of access do you have? What I can say, generally speaking, is if you have something very severe, most likely getting into that hard chamber at higher pressure is important.
Okay.
If you ultimately know that you need hyperbaric oxygen and you're willing to just give it more time, you then have the ability to be more flexible. In other words, there are definitely certain things that we use hyperbaric for that in a hard chamber at higher pressure, I could do more quickly. But you then have to drive 45 minutes to my office. You have to do this treatment, then drive 45 minutes home. You could have spent an hour and a half in your chamber in your living room, as an example. It was more convenient. It was easier for you to do. You got more of treatment time, and you don't have to come to my office 3 to 5 or 6 days a week. You just get to do it at home, you know, 5 or 6 or 7 days a week. And so it might take you an extra few weeks or a few months to get where you're going. But from a convenience standpoint or access standpoint, you still are probably going to get there. A lot of the consultations that I do, I do patient consultations for my clinic. I do some consultations for people who are looking at getting this therapy in other places, or I help other practitioners build protocols, you know, through the consultations that they're doing. And that's the thought process that we're always trying to address is like, what pressure, what frequency, what duration. But at the end of the day, convenience is a factor. Soft chambers are typically more convenient. Price is a factor. Soft chambers could definitely be more, you know, cost effective in certain times. And then the effectiveness is a factor, in which case certain conditions really need that extra boost. And in some small cases, we do both. So if somebody's doing 3 to 5 hours, let's say at home in a soft chamber, you know, for the repetition and the cumulative response. And then instead of coming to my office 3 to 5 times a week, they come once a week or twice a week for higher pressure, so that we give this boost in my office, then they take it home to maintain it. We give this boost to my office, then we go home to maintain it. So there's a couple different ways we work that in to try to get the most out of it.
That makes total sense. And when I rented mine, I got very lucky. It was $150 a week for that chamber. I know that's less than the cost of one single session in a hard chamber. So that is why I decided, hey, I'm going to rent it because I'm going to use it an hour, hour and a half a day, every day for 30 days. And what was that? $600. Yeah. So in that situation, the price was a driving force. It wasn't something life-threatening or critical. It was just to help further support my body, and it worked really well. So price was a big factor for me there. What would you say if a person's going to give it a go? How many sessions do you think they need before they can say it was helpful or not? Would you say 5, 10? I mean, I don't think one would be enough to see the benefits. And certainly it depends on the condition, but what would be a minimum that you think would be required to see benefits?
So hands down, severity is that driving force. There are definitely, like a mild concussion, we may only do 10 hours total period. Whereas autism spectrum, these kids might do 40 to 80 hours over the first 3 to 4 months. So there's a big range there. The way I typically explain that, just to almost like blanket statement, as many, 80% of the world, I would say that if I was explaining hyperbaric to a friend, most people would say, listen, first 5 or 6 hours, I don't know if anything's really happening. 8 to 12, I don't know if it's the hyperbaric or not, but I think something's happening, right? X, Y, or Z. From like 12 to 20, they're like, hey, that thing that I thought was happening, I'm starting to see that really consistently now. And then from 20 to whatever, that might be 30 or 40 or 50, whatever those changes are, seem to be exponential. There's a definitive delay. Even if you looked at all the testing that we did and the research that we've done, there's a definitive delay between when somebody starts hyperbaric and then we can measure any of those changes in their performance, in their blood chemistry, any of that stuff. So there's a delay between when you start and when you start to see changes. It's also really important to say that at some point we're going to stop the therapy, but we choose when to stop based on protocol, based on parameters. A lot of things play into that, but just because you stop the therapy doesn't mean you're going to stop the benefits. In almost all the research that's done on hyperbaric, you can stop you could do 30 or 40 hours, let's say, as an example. You could stop the therapy October 1st, and you will still see benefits throughout all of October and potentially even into November. There's usually somewhere between 3 to 6 weeks of continued benefit because you've already now created the momentum. That delay that was on the front side of the treatment from when you started to when you saw benefit, there's usually an equal delay or even a longer delay. I stopped the therapy. However, these things are still getting better. And so I think that's really important to make note when you're explaining this to people, to set those expectations. Yes, it's going to take a while to get going, but yes, it's going to keep going even once you stop.
Yes. Okay. So on the low end was 10 hours. So for some people, they might think, oh, well, I gave it 3 hours and I should feel this way. So perhaps it could be that more sessions, more time would be beneficial.
Yeah, I would say there are definitely early changers.
Okay.
First hour, second hour. I mean, I would say that I was an early changer. I was in there for 30 minutes, and 10 minutes later, I had pins and needles in a foot that I hadn't felt in 18 months. Like, right. That's a pretty quick exposure, in my opinion. So that happens. But I would say that's more the exception than the rule. The general rule is there's that delay. Now, the only difference to that is you might not see the benefit in the things that you're looking for, but like you brought up, like a wearable, almost everybody on their first session will see improved heart rate variability within that first session. Almost everybody who tracks their sleep will see increased deep sleep within the first 2 to 3 hours that they have done it. So there are changes that are measurable pretty quickly, but it takes devices like that. We don't necessarily know that in our own life. It takes an instrument to help shed light on those kinds of changes.
Yes. Okay. So last 2 questions. One would be just curious. It's not necessarily even related to this, but if you do a lot of flying, I really struggle with jet lag. So what would you say would be your biggest things? I'm going to assume one of those things will be doing hyperbaric oxygen therapy after landing, but what else helps you thrive if you travel as much as you do? I know both you and Melissa travel a lot.
We do. So one thing I try to do, and I can't recommend this necessarily, but I try to stay on my time zone.
Your home time zone?
Yeah.
Even when you're somewhere else? Okay.
So especially if it's a short trip.
Right.
So like I'm going to Houston for 36 hours. It's only a 1 hour difference, and I'm going to do my best. Like my sleep window is really tight. If I miss that sleep window, I get that second wind that just like completely sets me off. So I'm going to do my best. I'm going to land and go to bed tonight because it's going to be that close to that window. And I'm going to wake up early. I wake up early I wake up like between 4 and 4:30 every morning. I'm going to stay on that. Now that's going to be 3:30 where I'm going, but that's okay. Sometimes I do that anyway. So, to me so I try to maintain my windows as best as I can. Hyperbaric after 100% of the time. We also, I do a lot of nutrition, a lot of supplementation, things like that. So when I fly in general for my immune system, but also cognitive function, I use a lot of methylene blue and I use a lot of like NAD precursors. And so especially like I'll use primarily methylene blue while I'm gone, both for cognitive. So I can perform, I could do my lecturing, I could travel, I could not be sleeping well and still, perform the way I know I need to. And when I get back, my first couple mornings, as I'm like a little bit sluggish, those NAD precursors, I usually kick those up a notch so that it helps me improve my cognition and energy during the day but I also don't like pump caffeine and other things all day. I want to make sure I'm coming down. I can get back into that sleep rhythm, pretty quickly. And then 100% as much red light as I can. Red light in the mornings, red light at night, just to help stimulate those circadian rhythms.
Yes.
Those are like my biggest.
Okay. I do a lot of blue blockers. I always travel with red light. I'm going to start incorporating hyperbaric oxygen therapy and figuring out where I can go, especially if it's in a bigger city. And then I do use quite a few suppositories from Mitozen.
Yeah.
That can be helpful. Have you ever taken a Sandman suppository?
I have. So
What did you think?
I've done the suppository version. There's an oral version.
Mm-hmm.
Both work for me. I find that the liquid helps me more stay asleep throughout the night.
Okay.
But I've used both, and I go back and forth with both. The methylene blue I use is John's methylene blue.
Lumitol blue.
Lumitol, I love that.
Yes.
Yeah, so we use that a ton. I've used his NAD suppositories as well. So I'll use those as part of that program that I'm talking about. So yeah, for sure.
We have lots of different options. Okay.
Yes.
And then last question, is there anything that you would like to see people know about hyperbaric oxygen therapy, or in 5 or 10 years, would you like to see it more widespread? Like, what does the future of this treatment look like in your mind?
Yeah. So I hope that, because your example of that cost structure that you mentioned, I'll be honest, that's like pretty unheard of, even right now, rentals or purchases. So that's amazing. I would love that to be the norm.
Mm-hmm.
I do believe, like, in a hospital setting, literally, and this is one of the reasons why there aren't more approved indications, in my opinion. In a hospital setting, they charge somewhere between like $1,500 to $3,000 per hour.
Wow.
We charge about $200 per hour. So like it's tenfold. Mm. I do believe, my hope is that the more people we teach, the more chambers that are out there, the more people have awareness. If everybody who actually needed or wanted hyperbaric knew that they needed or wanted it and then had access to it, that would drive prices down a ton. Yes. And ultimately that would make it affordable for somebody like you and I to just be able to do it wherever and whenever we need it or want it. And I would look at it like that. Like, I use supplements as a way to balance my life when my life is crazy, and my life is crazy most of the time in different ways. So I have, cocktails and mixtures and potions that help balance me during those moments. Oxygen is one of those. And I think, today there's still so many myths and misconceptions around hyperbaric. Is it safe? Is it not? It doesn't work. Soft chambers don't work. Hard chambers only. There's so many myths out there that are just inconsistent with reality. So much of my time is literally trying to debunk all of those myths. I think I have at this point, like, almost probably over 300 videos on YouTube talking about like 5 to 7 minute, tidbits of hyperbaric information so people can digest it. But it's the whole purpose of that channel is literally just to debunk as many myths as humanly possible, because I want, for the future, I just want it to be almost everybody has a heart, a soft chamber potentially in their home. Like, it's just something we do. We eat healthy, we eat organic. Even if we're controlling as much of the stuff going in our mouths, are we still getting toxicity? Of course we are. Do we need to do things like periodically detoxify ourselves? Should we be doing things like coffee enemas to drive our systems in the right direction? Should we, even if I'm eating perfectly healthy, do I still need supplements periodically to balance my nutrition? Of course. And even if I'm 100% or close to it saturated with oxygen, do I still periodically benefit from a little oxygen boost throughout my weeks to help balance that? Of course we do. It's just, it makes perfect sense. So to me, it's one of those tools that becomes foundational for a person like myself, or for you, or for probably most of your audience. It just becomes this foundational tool that's like, of course, I expose myself to red light. Of course, I get a little extra oxygen. Of course, I do coffee enemas. Of course, I take supplements. Like, we live in a world that every month seems like we have a little less control over what's going on in our environment. We need to have more and stronger and consistent tools that protect us and our families and our health, so that, we can navigate that a little more smoothly.
Amazing. And I agree with you, accessibility. And sometimes people might be upset that these things are expensive, but I believe it was Dave Asprey who said cell phones used to be inaccessible to many people, and now pretty much everyone on the planet has one. So the more that we have these things utilized, the more accessible they will be over time. So I would also love to see that.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. And if you are willing to share your YouTube channel, I would love to include that in the show notes so people can dive in a little bit more and learn more, because you're such a wealth of knowledge. And is there another way that people can find you or work with you?
Sure. Yeah. So our main, like, as far as the education around hyperbaric goes, our main company is HBot USA. So the YouTube channel is HBot USA. Our Instagram is, I think, HBot USA. There might be like an underscore in there somewhere. Our main website is hbotusa.com. And so, and that's all we don't sell anything through any of that. That's all just like education. The whole purpose is just breaking through some barriers, debunking some myths, and helping people get the information they need to make educated decisions about how to navigate that part of their health. So they can find me through any of those channels. We do have a book, Oxygen Under Pressure, that I wrote a few years ago. It's available on Amazon. People could email us through our website or support@hbotusa.com. We get questions all the time, people trying to figure out, is this the right fit for them? I'm happy to drive people in whatever direction. If it's not a good fit, I'm going to let you know that too. It's not just like this is the cure for everybody. It's pretty unique and specific. So I'm happy to answer those questions.
Amazing. I'll include all of that information. And thank you again for your time. And I hope that you travel safely, recover well. I'm sure that you will. And thank you again. It was incredible.
Appreciate that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening to the High Maintenance Hippie podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast, rate it, and leave a review, ideally a 5-star review if you loved it. All of this is free of charge and really helps me to be able to run the podcast. If you take a screenshot and tag me, I'll repost you and shout you out on Instagram. So tag Ashley Taylor Wellness and High Maintenance Hippie Podcast. If you have any feedback or guests that you'd like to have, I would love to hear from you so that I'm not just talking at you. I really want to deliver things that are valuable. So send me an email with any feedback, suggestions, or ideas for guests at ashley@ashleytaylorwellness.com. And I will leave you with a disclaimer. Please know that this is not medical advice or replacement for seeking medical care. Everything discussed on this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. Always consult with your medical provider before making any changes. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.